Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today, Cliff and I aren't talking as long as we usually do, but we get into the nitty-gritty of how the US tax code works and the origins and operations of the IRS. Cliff does a really good job at breaking it down and making it understandable for the average layman. We hope you get value from this conversation.
Morning, Cliff. Thanks for being here again.
Good morning to you too. One of the things that I want to talk about this morning is the discoveries that I've made concerning federal income tax. The most important thing I've discovered is that the tax code cannot be read like a book, but rather like a combination lock. Certain things have to be put in place in a certain order in order for it to be valid. You think of a combination lock. What happens if you don't put in the correct series of numbers?
It won't open.
Right. And what happens if you have the correct numbers but you put them in the wrong order?
It won't open.
There you go. So it only works when certain situations are available. So the tax code is put together in the very same way that it was created through the acts of Congress. So it starts with a bill in the House or in the Senate, and whichever one passes it first, it moves over to the other body. And once the Tax Act is officially passed, it goes to the president for his signature. If the president applies his signature to the Taxing Act, that brings it into the first stage of law. The second step is for the Secretary of the Treasury to promulgate it into law. And what that means is that she has to apply the Code of Federal Regulations so that the regulations limit what the government can do, but the United States Code gives them the authority to do stuff. So you have authority coming in from one side from the United States Code, and then it's limited by the Code of Federal Regulations so that they don't go too far.
Right.
And then once that's done, she applies a part number, a Code of Federal Regulations part number, to the Taxing Act, and then she authorizes certain sections of the United States Code to be applied to that taxing law. So there are 9,300 sections in Title 26 United States Code, but for most taxing acts, only 35 or 40 of the 9,300 are authorized. And although there are some taxing codes from the United States Code that apply to pretty much all taxing acts, like 6001 requires records to be kept. Well, that's pretty much with every taxing act. Somebody has to keep records. So you have ones like that are in every one, but there's a whole lot of them that don't apply really to anything as yet. They're all laid there so that the Secretary of the Treasury has an option to either authorize it or leave it as it is.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like with CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, it's regulations for the federal government.
Right.
It's not regulations from the feds
to the citizen.
Right. This regulates the federal authority.
Right.
And that's what that's about, is the Code of Federal Regulations is the regulations on the federal authority that they have been granted through Congress.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And the Internal Revenue Code is only authorizes and also limits the IRS. It doesn't have anything to do with me or you. Right. They have a job to do, and as long as they do it in the order that it was created, it'll be accurate every time.
Right, just like the combination like you had referenced.
Right, yeah. So that's the biggest thing that I've discovered is that even though there are 9,300 sections of the code, they don't apply to every taxing act. As a matter of fact, there's not a taxing act where they all apply to a single act.
Okay.
So that's a basic understanding of where things go. What it doesn't do is it doesn't tell you, is there a taxing act that applies to your personal income stream? And now we get into the difference between the common vernacular of what the term income means to the code definition of the term income. And since this is all code stuff, the reason they use codes is that the code definition applies to the specific act from the time it is created until the time it is repealed. The meaning of the term does not vary in that entire time length, even if it's hundreds of years.
Right.
What they put on it the day that they made it was what it is, and if they want to change that, they have to make a whole new taxing act and cancel that one in order to apply a new one.
And that's one thing I've heard some people do in this space is they'll say, oh, it's code language, and they use that to confuse the masses, and that's why it's in code. Well, they're making the same exact mistake as where they're using the common vernacular. Like if I told you, we're going to have a coded language in order to communicate, people would assume espionage, private things, business things to guard against corporate espionage. But in this instance, the code, the legal term, it just means the coded language of what it means within the law, within the code.
Yeah, the term code means a secret special language. Mm-hmm. It only applies in certain instances. And one of the things that happened was in 1958, Bank of America was the first to create private credit cards. And they needed to know at that time whether a person was credit worthy. So they said, we have to have you put down what your income is. And income, for their purposes, means all sources of every piece of money you earn, from your wages to investments to rent, yeah, all of that sort of stuff, in order to know that you are credit worthy. At least that's the way it was back then. But people have used that terminology of income, which is for their purposes, to apply to everything. And it doesn't have any meaning like that in the tax codes.
Right.
The term income for code purposes means profit or gain arising from corporate investment.
Right. And that's where so many people get confused, is because they get stuck on this idea of, well, income tax applies to everyone because we all have income. And they're speaking two different languages.
Right. Yeah. Right. They sound the same, but they don't have the same meaning.
Right. Where if you're... And that's one of the things that some people just get stuck on. And I'm not entirely sure why they don't get the fact that, no, two words can mean two different things sometimes.
Right.
They can be spelled the same, pronounced the same, but that's not what they mean, because it's a different instance. It's a special secret language.
Right. Well, the Supreme Court says that the code vernacular can have the same meaning as the term, or as the word would have in the common vernacular. It could have a different meaning than the word would have in a common vernacular. It could have the exact opposite meaning of the common vernacular, but it would still be valid because it only applies to that situation, and Congress defined it as a part of that. There was a case a number of years ago. I'm going to say in the 40s or something, back then, where Congress placed an import tax on vegetables, including tomatoes. And a whole bunch of people said, well, wait a minute, tomato isn't a vegetable, it's a fruit. And technically that's correct. But Congress had specifically included tomatoes because they're eaten as vegetables. Most people would, have them as a vegetable or with vegetables. So they wanted to impose an import tax on vegetables, including tomatoes. It had nothing to do with, was a tomato a fruit or a vegetable?
Right. It just, they were clarifying
Right.
tomatoes are a part of that.
Right.
Even if they don't fit the exact definition because they're used as a vegetable.
Right. And if the Congress had not said that, including tomatoes, it wouldn't have included tomatoes because tomatoes is a fruit.
Right. Well, that's one thing we've talked about before, and it sounds a little tongue-in-cheek, but I really love it, is, the difference between knowledge and wisdom. And knowledge is knowing that tomato is a fruit, and wisdom is knowing not to include it in your fruit salads.
Right.
And that seems to me so far to be the best definition of wisdom that I've found, is wisdom is knowledge applied.
Right.
And knowledge isn't power
until it is applied
properly.
Right. Yeah.
In the right direction.
Right. Right.
Right. And that seems to be what it is with this combination lock of the tax code, is a lot of people know a lot of things and therefore they think they're knowledgeable, but if they don't know how to apply it and
if they can't open the combination lock,
does no good.
Yeah.
Right. They know all of the numbers, but if they don't know the specific numbers,
if they don't understand that there's a system involved here,
right,
and that they have to follow the system, and if they do follow the system, it will work out perfect every time.
Right.
So one of the challenges is because so many people don't understand the tax code, and if you read it like a novel, just page after page after page, it's not going to make any sense. There's going to be all kinds of contradictory things in there because they're not authorized for the same part number. There's Section 161 of Title 26 United States Code, Section 161, says that reasonable compensation for labor is not income. Section 3402 says that all wages, tips, and salaries are income. Well, that's two conflicting things if you just read it across like that. But whenever you put it into its context, Part 1 applies to income derived from sources that are regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, where 3402 is authorized for the Public Employment Act of 1939. So it's two entirely different taxing acts.
Right.
And they're not authorized for the same thing. They're completely separate.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. It's a bit like I would imagine for an onboarding handbook for an employee in a large corporation. There's a basic part of it that applies across the board, like a code of conduct.
Right.
And then each department has specific rules.
Right.
And one of the departments would be, if you have an issue, this goes directly to the CEO. You talk to the CEO.
Right.
And then one department would have for, if there's an issue, you report to this department.
Right.
And if you just have all of those books in one and you start to read through it, you'll be confused unless you know for which department you're working in.
Mm-hmm.
What part applies to what department when.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the military does a really good job in that their law book is called the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And there's a process in there where any soldier can have a question about his military service or about the authority of someone, and he can take it the whole way to the President of the United States, but he has to start with his squad leader. The guy that's in the front of the squad that he's in is the guy that you take the question to first. And if he can't answer your question to your satisfaction, then he moves you up to the company commander. And then from the company commander, it goes up a step, up a step, up a step. You're going up to the generals and then finally to the president of the United States, because he's the commander in chief of all the military.
Right.
And any situation can be done that way. However, you have to go step by step. You can't skip, you can't start with your question to the president.
Right. Right.
And if somebody can solve the problem to your satisfaction on the way up, that takes care of it at the lowest level. It's really like all laws are. Local comes first. Is it a city ordinance or something like that you're dealing with, or is it the county ordinance? Is it a state thing? Is it federal? Is it international? What is the process
Right.
that goes on for that particular thing that you're questioning?
Right. What about the history of the IRS? Because there's a lot of confusion around that too that I've heard. Why was the IRS started in the first place, and what's its role, or what is its role supposed to be?
Right. Well, the first thing, I imagine the first step would be to look in the Federal Register, because the Federal Register covers all acts of Congress that have ever been posted, have ever been processed, and see just exactly when Congress created the IRS. And you're going to find there's no posting in the Federal Register because Congress did not create the IRS. The IRS was created legitimately in 1903 because the Philippines had applied for independence as a nation. We had absorbed the Philippines as a federal territory because of the Spanish-American War of 1898. And 5 years later, they applied for their independence, and the United States said to them, if you pay X amount of millions of dollars in war reparation costs, we'll give you your independence. So they didn't have any money at the time. They were, creating a brand new nation, but as a nation, they would have certain taxing abilities. And so they filed a Chapter 11 reorganizational bankruptcy. And then they authorized certain taxes that they would have as a nation to pay directly to the United States to pay off the war reparations debt. And they needed to have, the bankruptcy court needed to have someone as an auditor to audit how much money was coming and to make sure that all the payments were there and everything like that. So the bankruptcy court trustee hired an outfit. It was the largest accounting outfit in the world at the time to handle that, because you're dealing with a whole country.
Right.
And they became known as the Internal Revenue Service because they were checking the internal revenue of the Philippines in order to audit their payment to the United States. So that situation was the United States was the creditor and the Philippines was the debtor, and the Philippines had to pay the debt to the creditor. In 1933, the President of the United States at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, declared the United States bankrupt and filed a Chapter 11 reorganizational bankruptcy. And the IRS moved over to collect, they don't collect debts for the Secretary of the Treasury, they collect taxes from the Secretary of the Treasury and turn it over to the creditor, which is Federal Reserve Corporation. So it's very legitimate. Everything that they're doing is completely legitimate, except for the fact that IRS agents are people just like everybody else. And there was a taxing act during the Second World War that applied to everybody's compensation for labor. And it was a 2-year limited tax to 2 years. But it was repealed 17 months after it was brought in. The problem was that whenever the Taxing Act was created, the Victory Tax Act was created, the Secretary of the Treasury required every newspaper, every magazine, every radio station to post notices about the Victory Tax Act and why the employer had to withhold and all of that sort of thing. They even had a Walt Disney cartoon made, a Donald Duck cartoon made, to inform everyone about it. So whenever, and everybody knew about it, they passed the thing in October 10th, 1942, and it was to go into full force and effect after December 31st at midnight, 1942, and it was to last for 2 years. But 17 months later, Congress repealed it. It was 16 months later, Congress repealed it, and then the president vetoed the repeal. It was his baby. He was the one that created it. Had his people bring it into the House and the Senate, and get the thing passed. And he didn't want it repealed, so he vetoed it. But Congress turned right around a month later and got enough vote to overpower his repeal of it. So
his veto.
Yeah, the veto of it. So the Secretary of the Treasury then was required to post the repeal in the Federal Register, and he did that. But he didn't do any public service announcements.
He just fulfilled his legal obligation.
Right. So my parents were a part of the war generation, and I found out about this in the early 70s, and I was back visiting with them, and they were having a big party with a bunch of their friends, and I had asked them about the Victory Tax Act, and both my mother and dad remembered it, and as the party was going on, I was going around talking to everybody their age about the Victory Tax, and they all remembered. Everybody had got the word that it was. Nobody knew that it was repealed. So that entire generation taught my generation that, oh yeah, you have to pay a tax on.
Because that's the way things are now.
Right, yeah, because that's the way things are. And that my generation taught the Generation X, and Generation X is teaching everybody else. But there is no taxing act.
Right. I don't think we've talked about it on the podcast before, but it's like that experiment they did where they put 12 monkeys in a giant pen, like a zoo, and on top of a pyramid type playpen structure, they put fresh fruit each day.
Mm-hmm.
And each time a monkey would try to get up to it, they'd use a fire hose to knock it off. And to the point where none of the monkeys would try to get the fruit. And then they would introduce a new monkey. They would swap them out. And the first time the new monkey went to get the fruit, all the other monkeys pulled him down.
Mm-hmm.
And then they just kept doing that until none of the original monkeys that had been fire hosed were still there.
Right.
And no one went for fruit. And then they swapped in a new one. and all of the monkeys who had not been fire hosed pulled the other monkey down.
Right.
It was just because this is how we've always done things. And it's a bit like a joke from Ronald Reagan. He was a fan of Soviet jokes. And one of his jokes is an American dies and unfortunately goes to hell, and he meets Satan, and Satan says, okay, I'll bring you along to, where you belong. And they're going along, and there are these pits surrounded by these little demons with pitchforks, and all these people are trying to climb out of these pits of hell, and they're being poked back in, and he sees a Frenchman with their berets, and he sees all these, he sees them all. Like, there's this whole joke about it. And then there's one pit where no one's trying to get out at all. They're just sitting there in the flame and pain. And the American goes, geez, what's up with that pit? And the Satan goes, oh, that's all of the Russians. They keep themselves in there, because each time one guy tries to get out, they always pull him back down.
Yeah.
And it was like, that was kind of the Soviet era.
Right.
Of, this is how it's always been done, and this is how we are. And,
right.
And,
well, and the first logical question that comes up is, okay, we can prove that by looking in the Federal Register at May 29th, 1944, was whenever the act was repealed. And it has just a simple statement. It says, the Victory Tax Act, formerly a part of Subtitle D of Part 1, is hereby repealed. That's what it says. There's not a lot of fanfare about it, but it does the job.
right.
The question, the logical question that shows up is okay, has there been another taxing act that would be similar to that is in full force and effect? Well, the only person that can answer that question is the Secretary of the Treasury. She's the only person that has authority that the courts would respect about taxation.
Right.
So what I recommend doing is to write to the Secretary of the Treasury and identify yourself. This is personal financial information, and she cannot just hand it out to anybody. You have a right to it, but she has to know that you're the person that you claim to be. So what you have to do is go to a notary and have your signature notarized, and you're saying to her, my name is so-and-so, my social security number is this, my birth date is this, my mother's maiden name is this, and then you swear under penalty of perjury that all that information is true, correct, and complete.
Making it a legal document.
Right. And it makes it a legal document that is admissible in any court of law or administrative tribunal process. So, I've lost the thought.
Well, to find out if you're a taxpayer.
Oh, right. So in order to find out, that's what you do, is you just ask her, you say, this is what I do for a living. Am I a person made liable to file a tax return? And if I am, what is the name of the taxing act and what is the part number so that I can determine how much I owe? And if you are a taxpayer and she would have administrative authority over you, she would also have an administrative duty to you. She has to answer if you're a person made liable. If you're not, she doesn't have to answer you because you're not within her scope of authority.
Right.
However, it isn't enough to just do it one time because, paperwork falls through the cracks all the time. Especially when you're dealing with the federal government. I mean, they have a very large round file. So you have to you would have to go back. You have to give her 60 days to answer, and it takes a week for the document to get to her and a week for the document to get back. So it takes up about 75 days. But if you don't hear from her from 75 days, you write to her again and you say, on this particular date, I sent you this document, copy enclosed, and you have not answered me. So I want to apply for an administrative review of my taxing status, and this is your application for the thing. So if she doesn't answer you again in another 60 days, then you write her the third letter and you say, I wrote to you this date, you didn't answer. I wrote to you this date, you didn't answer again. So I'm giving you another 60 days to answer if I'm a person made liable. And if you do not answer, I will not be filing another return or paying another federal tax until you tell me something different.
Right.
And then you can take all of those documents to your employer and say to your employer, why are you taking out this money and claiming that it's federal wages? I don't work for the federal government.
And as far as I can tell, we're not in an industry regulated by the federal government.
Right.
Right.
Right. And if you were, it would be up to your employer to provide documentation that, you are subject.
Because if he's taking out of your paycheck, he has to be able to show you why and why he's taking that percentage.
Right.
He has the duty to do so.
Right.
Right.
Right. And with you standing there presenting him with these letters where you tried to get the information that he supposedly has. I mean, he believes that he's required, because the Victory Tax Act wasn't publicly noticed that it was repealed.
Right. Well, it was just not broadly propagated.
Right.
Right. It
Right.
was just
It was
a legal
lawfully,
obligation.
yeah,
Right.
Yeah, it was legally repealed, but nobody knows that, or
Right.
very few people know that.
Right. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this up here. And the next time you come by, we'll expand more on this. And I think this was a really great encapsulation. And we'll expand on this more next time.
Okay, good.
Great, Cliff. Thank you so much for sharing, man.
Yep, thank you.
See you next time.